Racist staff mock black cleaning lady, unaware she's the new CEO. She was embarrassed, insulted, and even sought to be let go. However, who would have believed that the current owner of the company was the one who kept this pointless cleaner? Those who laughed at her might bid farewell to their roles as true justices right now. Subscribe so you won't miss fascinating tales of justice and fortitude written in the comments. What would you do if you were in her position? The boardroom humming with tension as Grace silently swept her mop and bucket over the floor. Though her mind was racing, movements were deliberate, slow. Seeing every talk, she notes every facial expression and commits the power relations in the room. She wasn't just any janitor. She was the lady who owned the building they stood in, the owner of the company they. Well, for the quiet observer choosing to momentarily hide her title as CEO should be aware of the actual problems with her new acquisition from A. She studied the men in their suits. Many of them were totally oblivious of her existence. They were preoccupied, considering which departments to lay off in order to save money, and how best to present their unavoidable drop as a regrettable but required. None of them knew that the one person who actually possessed the ability to monitor their fates was observing them. Grace had purchased this corporation a few months back when it was undergoing final decisions. Once a powerhouse leading in the edge of collapse, the company had been tech sector, but had subsequently collapsed under ego-driven, poorly managed leadership and a lack of creativity. What really caught her attention when examining the files was not the financial data or falling Jadit share, it was the obvious neglect of the staff, the pure disrespect for the workers, those who laid the groundwork for the company's success. Her choice to show up as a janitor was not made lightly. Grace had spent her life ascending from the ground. Born within a modest background, she had seen first how strong people ignored those they judged unworthy, and from the ground up created her company, ending up working many hours, proving oneself in crowded rooms full of individuals who usually observed simply her skin tone or gender. The lessons she acquired in humility, and 2 weeks had passed since she had started the mop. Endurance were the same ones that took her to this time. And pale, every day, she came upon the same terrible realities: casual racism, snarky disdain, and contempt. As soon as she assumed the position of, she turned invisible to the very individuals she was in charge of. Grace saw from the real issues inside her organization the need of knowing them from the standpoint of not only executive reports or spreadsheets, but from the employees. She bent down, cleaning a coffee stain from the floor as the voices in the room grew. One of the senior executives said, "Louder, we cannot keep paying for the benefits packages at this rate," stated. He was a towering man. "If we reduce 20% of the bottom," his voice dripped with conceit, "level staff could save enough to satisfy the board for another quarter." Many people nodded in agreement there. Her heart constricted as eyes concentrated on the charts on the wall. She had seen this approach repeated too many times before. Most damaging layoffs, severe cuts that reduced the personnel and demoralized the business, was being subjected to. Left bare from the inside out, without considering the long-term effects of this decisions. One of the men, Jade Hastings, a mid-level manager with aspirations much above, surpassed his skills, turned to quickly glance at Gracia before rolling his eyeballs. "These cleaners," he whispered under his breath, hardly audible to the others. "We might cut them too. I mean, they're hardly essential." "I'm not sure. Why do we even need so many of them?" The reply stung. Nevertheless, Grace kept her face neutral, still wiping an adjacent table. She had suffered more in her life. Still, she found it incredible how easily certain people could dehumanize others. Grace was not here to respond to petty insults. She had a mission when they thought none of anyone of importance was listening. Needed to know the rot in this organization, and each day of posing as at the bottom of the ladder revealed her. Later that day, how deeply it ran in the break room. Sitting beside one of the little round tables alone, Grace drank coffee from a chipped mug, surrounded her other staff members, gossiping uninformed of her existence, handling her as though she were one of the furniture pieces Jennifer, the administrative assistant, reclined against. "You heard about that new janitor she mentioned?" The counter, laughing with her colleagues. asked, her voice loud enough to guarantee Grace could hear her so softly hardly. Speaks a word, she most likely does not even speak English. A chorus of laughing ensued. Still, Grace stayed still. Her look was incomprehensible. The comments were familiar. Because she had discovered long ago that she could let such things pass off her back, but it wasn't. The rejades that unsettled her came from the complacency of others not challenging the casual racism no one advocated. For those who didn't deserve a second consideration, janitors found in events like these that Grace felt the weight of her choice to hide her contempt the decision. From those close to her, she could feel it, but she also had great insight. She now understood that the business culture was not only bad, but also poisonous from the inside out. She would have to act more then. Reorganize divisions and modify financial plans to help the moral basis of the business to be rebuilt. Later that evening, Grace completed her shift and strolled across the almost vacant office hallways. The place seemed different. She stayed close to the CEO's office, staring at night, nearly tranquil yet quiet. At the door, a metal nameplate bearing the name of the last owner still reflected few weeks would carry her name, and when it did, she would deliver a reckoning nobody had anticipated. Now, even though she would keep watching to listen through the humiliations and petty insults, she knew every single individual who had treated her with contempt would see her when the time came for who she really was, and at that same moment the balance of power would change. Gracia inhaled deeply and turned away from the desk toward the door. The cool, clear night air was a pleasant release from the great stress she could not help but build during the day as she strolled to her car. Imagine the approaching storm they would not have seen. They never did, but she was ready. She had always been. The next day started exactly like the others had. Ignoring her janitor's uniform and entering the office, Grace Dawning sensed the weight of her mission more strongly than before. The contempt for the casual racism, it was all part of a system she would shortly destroy. For now, but she would soon had to live, since real transformation takes time and calls for patience. And Grace had long ago developed the virtue of patience. As she pushed him a pop down the stairs, she knew that shortly the same those who discounted her would be clamoring for her attention when the morning sun danced across the big glass business building windows as Grace once more embraced her position as an like she strolled among the vehicles in her janitor's uniform. She saw an invisible component of the company's ecosystem. It was like if she had turned into a shroud of invisibility to the workers whirling about her. She wasn't a person they knew, saw her as simply the person. She was not someone with ideas or sentiments. Janitor whose tolerance and patience were all too evident day after day, as her endurance was measured in terms that would have broken smaller people today. No exception as she pulled her cleaning cart into one of the meeting rooms, a gathering of staff members already underway. Animatedly discussing the forthcoming layoffs, Grace strolled to the far end of the room, carefully slow-moving floor sweepers trying to remain observed long enough to compile more of their unvarnished ideas. They seemed intending to cut another 15% of the workforce. One of the women rejadied, with a voice full of there was Jennifer once more, the same administrative assistant who had laughed at Grace only a day imagine before. I bet half of these janitors will be out the door shortly. They are hardly required, as her speech reflects a casual contempt that was all too familiar to Grace. Was the same tone she had come across from those who thought that during her career, from people who her job title let one determine their value. She stayed silent, concentrating on her efforts as they carried on their discussion, giggling as they conjectured regarding who would be the next to travel. Jade Hastings, the ambitious mid-level manager who had laughed at the concept of cleaners the day before, intervened. To be honest, I have no idea why we need so many of them. They stroll about as though they are vital, but I have never seen. She clenched her teeth, but they do anything that warrants more than one or two in the whole building. Maintained a neutral attitude as she understood how simple it was for people like Jade to produce quick decisions on people without second consideration. They were so engrossed in their own sense of superiority and ambition, which they unable to perceive the value in anyone who deviated from limited perspective of accomplishment. As the day turned out, Grace's Encounters with her colleagues only became more disrespectful in the break room. She drank her coffee from the same table by herself as usual. Chipped mug, the room hummed with idle conversation as additional staff members gathered. Grace had learnt to ignore small groups laughing and talking about their weekend plans. Their talks, but tonight the words cut a little further. One of the males, a young intern Tim, was chatting loudly behind the coffee maker with. I mean, how hard can his buddies keep so many janitors around? It'd be to clean a facility. They simply sweep rooms and wash down desks, right? My grandmother could do that. Laughter burst around him, and Grace felt her hands close to her mug's handle. She had long since learnt to withstand rejades like this. Let her roll off her back without displaying any outward reaction. Within, she felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype of being assessed just by the outfit Tim wore. Tim turned to look at Grace's eyes dart over her as if she were a piece of furniture. I mean, look at her, doesn't even talk to anyone, most likely doesn't know English. More laughing followed, and Grace kept her eyes squarely on her coffee, unwilling to provide the gratification of a. She could feel the heat building in her chest as her wrath bubbled under the surface, but she ate it down. These folks didn't know her, or what she was able to do was unknown to them. The woman they were disparaging was the very one who would shortly own their. She controls her professional life. The afternoon delivered more of the same as Grace moved across the office, completing her regular duties, the disdain virtually disappeared. Still as contemptuous as ever, intolerable Jade Hastings still called her over, and he sat at his desk fixating on his computer screen. You said not even been. Why not you take care of the overflowing garbage can? He waved her toward him and bothered to glance up. Moved over coolly, her expression flat. She looked at the garbage container. It wasn't even half full. She could sense the other staff members staring at her as Jade ignored her presence with a practiced ease, continued to scan through his emails, then pulled the bag out of the can, wrapped it up and swapped it for a fresh one. She said nothing except that the stillness between them was intolerable as she turned to go and heard Jade murmuring to a colleague, I swear these people are so slow. They most likely believe they should be paid more since they lack urgency. She had heard it all, simply for showing up. The words repeated in Grace's mind as she turned away. Prior to dismissal, the casual racism that crept into the very fiber of the company, it was a too familiar refrain in her life, one she had to live when she was a young girl. Yet Grace understood something Jade and the others lacked stamina for. Weakness, strength. After that evening following most of the staffs left for the day, Grace discovered she was alone in the office. She was standing in front of, still displaying the name of the former owner, the CEO's office door. In a few short weeks, her name would take place instead of his, and the very ones who, though for now she was still treated like an afterthought, would come to see the weight of their acts. The janitor still unseen, and that was exactly what she needed to be. As she strolled in the vacant halls, she considered the year's worth of lessons she had acquired on patience. She had an edge since the people around her had no idea who she was, and since endurance and the power of silence were unknown. They found it incomprehensible that Grace had gone through worse in her lifetime, the insults. She was not new to the casual bigotry. What counted was the final game. She pushed her cart toward the exit, the night air chilly on her. Grace had always been a brilliant tactician. Skin as she left the peace of the evening was a pleasant change from the noise of the day, and as she headed to her car, let herself in a few weeks, the power relations will change. The individuals who had teased her would soon find themselves at her favor, and Grace would have the chance to implement the transformation this business so sorely needed. But change takes time. For now, she had to. She kept doing her part. The office was clearly tense the following day. Workers were on edge, and rumors of layoffs were spreading like wildfire. Not knowing what the future contained, Grace realized the moment for action was getting close. She had acquired sufficient knowledge, endured enough shame, and now it was time to move forward into the office. Her thoughts were on the forthcoming board meeting. Executives will be debating the company's future, and though Grace understood their choices would only exacerbate things, this time she wouldn't stand by and observe this time. She would voice the storm was arriving, and Grace was ready. The morning dawned dreary, throwing and ominous. The typical activity in the corporate halls in the office building was more subdued than light coming through the glass windows. Always humming with nervousness and conjecture, Grace dressed in her, as she had every day for weeks, the janitor's uniform moved throughout the building. But today seemed different. The air seemed to be charged with approaching catastrophe. Focus that flowed through every exchange, every report of layoffs had carried like wildfire, and the whispers of approaching catastrophe got louder every hour today. Everything would change. This day would jade a turning point not only for the business but also for her personally as well. The destiny of the company would be decided at the forthcoming board meeting. The executives would once more gather to decide on choices impacting hundreds of lives. They would go over budget cuts and the likelihood of eliminating whole departments. Grace had saw this situation where executives attempting to save their own positions gave up the function of. She felt a weird mix of expectation as she wheeled her cleaning cart down the corridor, those she judged expendable, and rectify the slights, the contempt the casual had caused. Racism all for this moment. It wasn't only about rescuing the business, it was about proving something to the world. She had as well as to the staff seen the decay from the inside out, and now it was time for boardroom action. Grace arrived to start cleaning the long glass table and already occupied sleek leather chairs. Though the meeting still had 1 hour to go, the executives had assembled early in small groups to go over the approaching crisis. In subdued tones, Grace identified most of them by now using the same features that had written off her as a mere fixture in the room. Jade Hastings, as usual, as useless and inconsequential. Front and center, his strong voice filling the room, he was in the middle of what appeared to be an impromptu pep talk. Though his approach was more self-congratulating than some of the other top managers. Inspired, we will have to make some difficult decisions today, he advised, crossing our arms with a confident self-assured smile. But it's for the benefit of the business. We cannot keep all these extraneous employees paid for. Several more nodded in agreement. Then time to cut the fat. As Grace cleaned the conference table, unneeded people, she couldn't help but get a flash of rage. She had seen the stares of people calling their staff members as though their livelihoods didn't count. She felt disposable. Anxiety and worry on the faces of the lowest level employees, the same ones who would suffer most from the decisions being produced in this chamber. Hastings, unaware of her presence, as usually maintained the janitorial staff alone. Maybe cut in half. We don't need that many workers to maintain the facility clean. Hell, I guess we could outsource the whole department, and kept her eyes on the table. Grace saved a fortune. She had heard enough over the preceding 3 weeks to grasp the actual character of these people, how readily dehumanized people, turning them into numbers on a spreadsheet for a business report. But she wouldn't be silent today. The hour passed rapidly, and soon the room filled. As the conference was called to commence, the other executives all sat around the table. Grace walked to the room's corner, merging into the background, and the strong men overlooked her existence as the janitor and ladies who would shortly choose the paths of their staff. The CEO, a man, Richard Owens, stood at the top of the table, his face solemn. Trouble, he started without preamble. Our estimates over the coming quarter show worse than expected. If we should not act right away, we are looking at a total collapse and must hence reduce expenses all around. Implies severe layoffs. Grace paid great attention as the executive after executive presented their own rendition of the same faulty solution they discussed. Cutting employment, shutting whole departments, lowering benefits, never mentioned innovation. Cutting corners, saving their own skins dominated development or investment in the people running the business. Ignoring the long-term effects. Let's start with one of the executives, administrative staff one, rejaded, looking at the stack of papers before him. We could trim their figures by at least 25%, should allow us adequate breathing space for the upcoming quarter. And the staff, Jade Hastings, the janitor, swiftly added that we could outsource that totally. We can have a third-party company handle the same work for half the cost. Therefore, there's no need to retain them on payroll. Grace's hold on her mop's handle tightened as she heard enough to know. Presently, should she fail to intervene, the business would fall into a catastrophe avoidable with regard to the judgments being made. Made Today was not about rescuing the business. They were meant to save the careers of the executives at the expense of. For weeks, she had kept her identity disguised, watching, studying, and knowing the whole extent of the issue. But now it was time to tell the truth. Grace was ready to take control, but she had to act deliberately instead of out of passion while the bosses carried on.
Grace G.
Bentley put her mop aside and moved to the head of the table Richard Owens was seated at. Gently tapped him on the shoulder while her heart hammered in her chest, ready to discard the front she had put up. Kept for so long, she stated, her voice steady but firm. Owens turned to her, startled by the interruption, his brows wrinkled in perplexity as he examined her, not seeing the woman before him. Sure, what is it? Grace looked back. I believe it's time to speak. The room fell silent without flinching, all eyes. Her executives looked at her perplexingly, not sure what to think of the janitor. Jade Hastings, standing at the head of their table, always the opportunist, broke the stillness first. What are you doing? With his voice drizzling with contempt. This is a private meeting for which you have no business. Grace ignored his tone. Rather, she reached into her pocket and grabbed a little envelope, the very exact envelope with records proving her ownership of the organization. She had been waiting for this moment, just ready to see how far they would travel before she unveiled the truth. I believe you will discover that I have every right to be here, she stated coolly, delivering Richard Owens the envelope. Today I shall be making the decisions about this company's direction. Future. Owen looked at the envelope in wonder, then tore it open and examined the paperwork within. His face grew pale as he perused the documentation verifying Grace as the principal owner of the company he searched for her at. His voice almost above a whisper. This cannot be right. Oh, it is quite right. Grace answered, her voice steady as she addressed the room. I had owned this company for weeks now, and I had been observing, listening, and learning all about how it has been run. I have heard enough to know that the room exploded in anarchy as you made decisions that would ruin it. Executives talked with one another, trying to understand what was happening. Jade Hastings's face reddened the most. Furious as he got out of his chair. You cannot do this. You are merely a janitor. Grace turned to him, her eyes icy and unforgiving. I'm not simply anything. I'm lady who now oversees your employment, income, and company's future. And I'll be certain that those who believe they can walk all over others without repercussions are held in such manner. The room went quiet once more as her words sank in weight. Grace turned to study the faces of the executives who had turned her aside for weeks. The same people who had teased her, ignored her, and denigrated her. She had survived their arrogance, their prejudice, their ignorance, and now she stood before them as their supervisor. The fallout from Grace's revelation was quick and severe. The power balance in the room changed entirely when she settled at the head of the table. The executives who had earlier possessed all the authority and was now rushing to defend their positions. Grace showed no interest in conserving the ancient methods. She was here to destroy the corruption that had grown in first order of business for the corporation and rebuild it from the bottom up. Was easy to guarantee that people who had maintained the poisonous culture were no longer part of it. Jade Hastings and others like him would soon find themselves unemployed, and Grace would start the process of turning the business into a venue where every staff member, in whatever capacity, was handled with elegance and respect. The boardroom sat shocked. As the weight of Grace's revelation settled in her eyes, stillness. The room was tight with tension. Every set of shocked, incredulous eyes with a steady look. She could see the shock on their faces, the incredulity that the woman they discounted as nothing more than a janitor would cause now carried their fates in her hands for weeks of treatment with contempt, never realizing she was the actual company's power source today. Worlds were ready to fall apart. Let the quiet linger a little more. Sensing the change in power, the very persons who had denigrated and laughed at her were now at her will, and they understood. The air buzzed with a mix of terror, uncertainty, and resentment, yet none dared to say, "Not yet." Jade Hastings' face. First to disturb the silence he shot from his chair fists was still heated from the outburst moments ago. "This is ludicrous." Tight eyes ablaze with fury, he yelled, his voice breaking. "Desperate. You are merely a janitor unable to enter here and behave as you would." "Own the place." Grace turned to him slowly. Her voice was solid as steel. "But I have owned the place, Jade. I have for weeks before you ever realized I was here, and throughout that period I saw exactly how you and others like you treat the people running this organization." Twisted in fury, but there was something else behind it now. He knew what was about to happen even if he wasn't ready to own it. Grace moved closer to him, her voice subdued but firm. "For weeks, you denigrated and demeanored the employees of this company, calling them superfluous and saying they didn't matter. Well, now you will see what it feels like to be the one who doesn't matter." Hastings started to dispute, but before he could add another word, Grace responded coldly, "You're fired," raising her hand to quiet him. Locking onto his effective immediately. "Security will guide you out of the building." A wave of gasp passed through the room. Hastings' face lost color as the truth of her words struck him. "I have been with this." He slurred, his voice now tainted with panic. "Years. I know how things go here." Grace met his stare without flinching. "And that's exactly why I knew years. Jade, long enough to believe you're being let go. You have been here too long. Invincible, but you're not." Anyone before Hastings could react to. As Grace nodded lightly to Mr. Hastings, leaving the room, security personnel stood at the entrance. The building, she directed, her tones strong. The guards advanced near Hastings, searching the room for backup. But none of them came to defend. They were all either stunned or afraid of losing their own places. Hastings whispered under his breath. The soldiers took him out. His confidence was dashed when the door closed. The room stayed hushed behind him, the tension evident. Grace turned back to her, look unreadable now. She stated her remaining executives, voice slicing through the suspense like a razor. "Let's discuss the direction this business." Rich Owens still sits in. The head of the table gently cleared his throat, evidently rasped by the unexpected turn of events. Miss Sanders started carefully. "If I could ask what precisely you intend here. I believe we are all rather confused about the direction you intend to go." Take. Grace nodded gently, staring around the room as she whispered, "My simple intentions. Your organization has been in freefall for months, and your actions have been based on. I acquired this corporation to save it, but if the same poisonous leadership continues, it will lead to failure." Stays in place. Her rejades hung in the air, implying clearly she wasn't merely come to revamp the whole culture, replacing a few individuals. People believing they can treat others like their disposable. Grace have been running this business for far too long. Kept you discussing outsourcing departments like it's nothing, but you have forgotten that behind it is job loss. Every number represents someone you neglected whose success of this firm depends on. Among the employees here, not only the executives, but also the cleaners, the administrative staff members, measured, controlled, yet the passion underlying their rejades was evident. Ground-based personnel. She had clearly spent her whole career battling the kind of elitism and conceit she possessed, saw in this business, and now she could act to change things. "The way this organization has been operated is unacceptable," Grace added with stern voice. "And beginning today, that changes for the next hour." Grace lay out her vision for the company's future, explained her ideas for reorganizing not through layoffs and budget savings, but discussed innovation development and investments in the staff members who had been disregarded for so long. Concepts of long-term sustainability that had been badly lacking in the debates guided by some of the former CEOs, listened silently, still attempting to handle the radical change in leadership. Others, obviously terrified of losing their places, bowed in eager support for the new direction, but Grace wanted actual change and was not interested in sick aunt. And it meant eliminating the dead weight at the top by several more executives by the end of the conference. Had been gently discounted their already ready severance packages. Grace made it plain that anyone who couldn't see her vision would not be patient and would not. Later that evening, following most of the new course, one would show the door ready to welcome it. Grace strolled across the now vacant halls as the executives left the facility. The office seemed different now, quieter, almost peaceful, knowing that although she had made adjustments today, there is still much to be done. For the first time, though, weeks later, she felt successful as she passed the workplace. Where her name would shortly be etched on the door, she stopped momentarily to consider the path that had been taken. She had suffered weeks of humiliation and degradation at this point, but it had all been worthwhile. She had seen the actual character of the people who had before had leadership in this business, and today they were gone, but more. Crucially, Grace had demonstrated something to herself. She had always known she had the will to achieve, but now she possessed the ability to transform the life of the individuals employed under her. She had the chance to build a business where everyone was appreciated, where nobody was considered as disposable as she stood in. She let herself a little smile when the storm had passed into the still hallway. And a week later, Grace had come triumphant. The company was humming with renewed energy. Word had spread rapidly regarding the modifications Grace had made, and the staff members who had worried about their employment now warily hopeful about the future. The poisonous culture that had once permeated the workplace was being destroyed piecemeal by piece, and in place something fresh was developing. Grace at her new workplace. On her workstation, her view of the city skyline stretched out before her was a stack of files, each one signifying a fresh chance, a new path for the business. She had always thought that power or titles didn't define leadership. It was about the influence you had on those close to you, and now she had the opportunity to set an example as she chose. There was a knock at her door as she ascended the first terrible, eager to start the labor ahead. One of the janitors was a young woman hired just a few days earlier. She seemed tensely unclear. Should she be pestering the CEO? Grace waved her in not to worry her. Replied, her voice warm. What can I do for you? The woman paused briefly. Before speaking, I wanted to thank you for all you have done. I have never worked at an environment where someone like me was treated with respect. Her heart filled with pride, and she grinned. Welcome. Keep in mind, everyone here deserves respect regardless of. The woman nodded, then went. Grace slumped back in her chair. Their duty is what? Though the job was only starting, she knew that collectively they would create something great. She felt great happiness. Really fantastic. This time nobody will be left behind. Thank you for viewing the narrative. Remember to subscribe to avoid missing fresh episodes. Click the bell and view the next videos for more information. Amazing tales abound in the comments. Share this video with your friends and let them know what most impressed you. Disclaimer. This channel is opposed to all forms of discrimination, bigotry, intolerance, and human rights violations. The narratives presented here are original works that were crafted to foster constructive dialogue, comprehension, and introspection. The production of all content is guided by a dedication to the preservation of human dignity and the respect for diversity.